Your first two standards in the respiratory system cover the respiratory anatomy and the process by which gas is exchanged when it reaches the terminus of the lungs. Your LUNG.1 standard reads, I can trace the flow of air as it passes through the organs and major structures of the respiratory system, while LUNG.2 explains the exchange and transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide within the body. All right, Unit 13, the respiratory system. So the respiratory system has a lot of air passageways, and its primary and sole function is to filter that air and get it into the tiny air sacs in the bottom of your lungs, well, lining all around at the end of these airways, the end of your lungs, to exchange the gas. So we discussed carbon dioxide and oxygen a lot when we were talking about blood and when we were talking about the cardiovascular system. So this is the other half of that story. How do we get the oxygen in and the carbon dioxide out? You have an upper and a lower respiratory tract, and so you may have heard of these if you have an infection. It's important to note if an infection is more up in your head and neck area, or if it's a very deep infection down in the sensitive and critical lung tissue. So the upper respiratory tract includes your nasal cavity, all of your sinuses, your pharynx, and your lower respiratory tract picks up with the larynx, trachea, bronchial tree, and lungs. In LUNG.1, you have to know the sequence of respiratory anatomy. So which structures is air passing by as it moves down into your lungs? So first is your nose and nasal cavity. You have a very narrow nostril right here that opens up into a much wider and larger nasal cavity. In here, you have hairs that have a crucial function of filtering air. So if you've ever seen like those speckles of dust in the sunlight, those are dead skin cells. And the hairs inside your nose have to filter that out. There's pollutants, there's pollen, there's just so much that you don't want down in your delicate lung tissue, and those hairs can catch those things, form boogers, which I don't know if there's a scientific name for, there must be, and eventually expel them. In your nose, you're also warming and moistening the air. We're not going to talk about your mouth at all. You're not supposed to be a mouth breather, even though it's effective and you can do it, even when you're working out. You're supposed to breathe through your nose so that the air becomes warm, it's filtered, and the mucus in there can moisten it. Your nose and nasal cavity is also responsible for your sense of smell, and there are different kinds of cells in here that help achieve those functions listed above. So first, goblet cells. Goblet cells are the ones that are producing that mucus that sits all around the hairs, helps to moisten the air, but also traps those microorganisms and contaminants. So the hairs catch them, and then the goblet cells produce mucus to keep them there. Those tiny hairs, aside from the big ones you can see, those tiny hairs are called cilia, just as they were called when we were discussing the digestive system. We talked about villi. Cilia are very similar in shape. We've seen these on cell types in the tissue category as well. All right, after that, we've moved air into your nasal cavity. We'll pass by a number of sinuses. So if you've ever had a sinus infection, you know that these are air-filled spaces, or at least they're supposed to be, in different regions of your skull. So in your frontal bone, in your maxillary bone, in your sphenoid bone. These spaces are supposed to be filled with air, but if bacteria find their way in there, if the mucus didn't catch it and the cilia didn't catch it, then unfortunately you get fluid building up in there, you get bacteria, and you'll feel intense pressure in those sinuses. Here's the sinus in your frontal bone, for example. Here's the one in your sphenoid. The purpose of sinuses is to make your skull less heavy and also helps reverberate voice resonance. I've also read theories that they can house supportive fluids, but Ultimately, your textbook just mentioned skull weight and voice resonance. Once the air has passed down, if it's heading in the right direction, it's going to go through the pharynx, which we also talked about in the digestive system. It's just that passageway for food or air. In the digestive system, the epiglottis shut down over the larynx and the trachea, and so food went down the esophagus. But now we're breathing, and so we want the epiglottis to stay open so that the air can make its way into this anterior tube, which ultimately winds up in the trachea. In the lower portion, we'll start with the larynx. The larynx is just superior to the trachea, so it's right after that epiglottis, and your vocal cords are housed here. So if you're male, you can feel a big cartilaginous bump known as your Adam's apple. That's the anterior portion of your larynx, but regardless, your vocal cords are housed here. From there, we go down into this ribbed structure called the trachea. It's, as I mentioned, anterior to the esophagus, and it's ribbed with all of these hyaline cartilage rings. That allows it to stay inflated in the event of any sort of trauma or pressure to your neck. It tries to keep your windpipe open. From there, the air is going to start to branch, much like we did with blood vessels. We see this branching, and that's called your bronchial tree. From big to small, we have big bronchi, smaller bronchioles, and at the tips, we have these structures that look like bubbles or little branches of grapes, and those are called alveoli. Alveoli are the most critical structures and also the most sensitive. This is where capillaries are wrapped, ready to trade oxygen for carbon dioxide. The entire structure that includes the bronchial tree and all those alveoli together, that soft spongy organ, is called the lung. Your second standard is brief in content, but it is really important, and it's about gas exchange. So back to the alveoli. Alveoli are microscopic. They're incredibly small, and they also have to be thin enough to allow for gas exchange. So in this picture here, we have a capillary down at the bottom, lined by simple squamous epithelium, and we have an alveolus, which we were way zoomed in on, also lined with simple squamous epithelium. The thinness of these cells makes the structures really sensitive, but also allows for easy diffusion. To remind you, diffusion is the passage of molecules from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. In this case, it's due to differences in partial pressures. So we can see in the alveolus and in the capillary, for instance, at the beginning, the pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood is greater than it is in the lungs. So carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the blood into the lungs. That's good because then we can breathe it out every time we exhale. Oxygen has the opposite set of pressures. We see the pressure of oxygen at 104 millimeters of mercury, the pressure in the capillary only at 40. And so oxygen will diffuse out of our lungs into the blood so that it can be carried to all the different tissues in your body that need oxygen to function. So a very effective transfer of gases is happening in the alveolus picking up CO2, dropping off O2, and by the end of this, we have oxygenated blood that's going to head back to the heart. Your case study for the respiratory system is a condition called cystic fibrosis. This is a hereditary condition, and we're going to hear a podcast from a young woman who is suffering from cystic fibrosis who will end up getting a lung transplant. So we can start to think about how do we solve genetic disorders, what are the complications with lung transplants, and ultimately what is the physiological impact of cystic fibrosis.